There are families that look perfect from the outside, and inside, they are a museum of secrets. Every photograph hides a story. Every smile conceals a wound. Every locked door guards a truth that someone, somewhere, decided the world should never know. This is a story about one such family, and about the boy who walked through their front door carrying every single one of those secrets, wrapped in silence, dressed in innocence, and waiting to be unleashed. My name is Sandra Whitfield. I am 42 years old. I am a wife, a teacher, and after 14 years of trying, finally a mother. Or at least, that was what I told myself the day we signed the adoption papers for a 16-year-old boy named Marcus Cole. I want you to understand something before this story begins. I was not a suspicious woman. I was not the type who looked for problems beneath the surface of good things. When the adoption agency described Marcus as quiet, intelligent, and emotionally reserved, I heard hope. I heard a child who needed love. I heard the answer to every prayer I had whispered in the dark. What I did not hear, what no one told me, was that quiet can sometimes mean watchful, that intelligent can sometimes mean dangerous, and that reserved can sometimes mean a person is waiting, biding their time, holding something back that will change everything the moment it is finally released. My husband David and I had been married for 16 years. We lived in a comfortable 4-bedroom home in a quiet suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina. We had built a life that most people would call blessed. Stable jobs, a beautiful home, deep roots in our community, a marriage that had survived grief, disappointment, and the particular kind of slow heartbreak that comes from wanting children and watching that dream slip further away with every passing year. Adoption had been David's idea first. Then it became mine. Then it became ours, something we pursued with the kind of fierce, trembling hope that only people who have lost something precious truly understand. We went through all the classes, the home studies, the background checks, the interviews. We were approved, certified, and placed on a waiting list. And then, 11 months later, the agency called about Marcus. He was 16. He had been in the system for 3 years, bounced between 4 different foster homes. His biological parents were deceased. He had no living relatives. He had tested in the 98th percentile for academic ability. He was described as a young man of unusual depth and perception. We said yes, without hesitation. And that was the beginning of everything. He arrived on a Tuesday. By Friday, I was sleeping with the lights on. The social worker's name was Ms. Patricia Greer, a tall woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a sensible cardigan. She pulled up in front of our house at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, and Marcus stepped out of the passenger seat before the car had fully stopped, as though he had been holding his breath the entire drive and needed to exhale the moment he saw the house. He stood on our front walkway and looked at the house. Not at me, not at David, who was waving from the porch. He looked at the house, and the expression on his face was not what I expected. It was not nervousness. It was not the shy hopefulness I had imagined. It was something quieter and stranger than that. Something that looked, in that first unguarded moment, almost like recognition. "I was looking for an extension cord," he said, without looking up. "I found this. I hope that's okay. These are really beautiful photographs." I crossed the room and looked at what was in his hands. It was a photo from my parents' house, taken at least 15 years before Marcus was born. My father, my mother, myself as a teenager, and in the background, barely visible, a young man I recognized with a lurch of cold nausea. A young man named Ray Holloway, who had been my father's business partner, and who had died in a fire that the police had ruled accidental and that I had spent every year since trying not to think about. "Who's this?" Marcus asked, pointing directly at Ray. "An old family friend," I said. My voice was even. My hands were not. Marcus looked at the photograph for one more long moment. Then he set it carefully back in the box and stood up. "He looks familiar somehow," he said. He went upstairs. I stood in the living room with the box of photographs and felt the specific, targeted chill of a person who has just been handed a warning they do not yet understand. "That night," I told David. He laughed, kissed my forehead, said I was overthinking it. "He's a curious kid," David said. "That's a good thing." I wanted to believe him. I almost did. Lesson woven in: avoidance is not the same as resolution. Secrets do not disappear when we stop talking about them. They merely go underground, where they grow roots and wait. Addressing painful truths while they are manageable is infinitely less costly than confronting them after they have had years to expand. He said my father's middle name at dinner. My father had been dead for 8 years. I had never, not once, told anyone his middle name. Not David. Not the adoption agency. Nobody. It happened on a Thursday, 14 days after Marcus moved in. We were eating dinner, roasted chicken, David's specialty, the kitchen smelling of rosemary and garlic, and we were having one of those careful, surface-level conversations that families in transition have when they are all trying very hard to seem normal. David was telling a story about his day at work, something about a miscommunication with a client, and Marcus was listening with that attentive, slightly too still quality he had, and I was refilling glasses and only half paying attention, and then David said, "So Sandra, your dad used to work in finance too, right?" Before he passed. A normal question. An easy question. A bridge-building attempt. And before I could answer, Marcus said, quietly and with complete casualness, "Your father's name was Gerald Morton Whitfield. He went by Jerry. He was a financial advisor for 23 years. He died of a heart attack 8 years ago, February 14th. Valentine's Day. You were with him when he died." The silence that fell over that table was absolute. I set down the water pitcher. David stopped talking mid-sentence. We both looked at Marcus, who was cutting his chicken as though he hadn't just recited facts that were not available anywhere, not on any website, not in any adoption file, not in any document any social worker had ever seen. Gerald Morton. Morton was my father's middle name, a name I had never told another living soul since his death. Not David. We had married after my father died, and names had simply never come up. Not the adoption agency. Not any friend. It was a small, personal detail I had kept private because privacy was the only form of possession I had left of him. How do you know that? My voice came out barely above a whisper. Marcus looked up. He seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction, or was performing surprise very well. "You told me," he said simply. "I have never told you that." He frowned. A crease appeared between his brows. I must have read it somewhere then. In the agency files, maybe. He paused. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you." David reached across the table and covered my hand. "It's okay," he said to Marcus. And then to me, low and gentle, "Breathe." But later that night, after Marcus had gone to his room and David was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and the adoption agency's entire file on Marcus Cole. I went through every page, every document, every form. My father's middle name was nowhere. Not on a single page. Marcus had not read it. He could not have read it. And yet he knew. Lesson woven in. When something inexplicable happens, our first response is often to explain it away, to protect our comfort by denying what our instincts are telling us. But truth does not require our belief to exist. The courage to investigate, rather than rationalize, is often the first step toward a reckoning that, however painful, sets us free. I Googled Marcus Cole at midnight. What I found made me wish I hadn't. What I found made me unable to stop. Sleep became a negotiation after that dinner. I would lie down, close my eyes, replay the moment, Marcus's calm voice, the precision of the details, the name Morton floating in the air between us, like something conjured. Then I would be awake again, pulse elevated, mind running calculations I couldn't make add up. David remained steady and gentle in his insistence that there was a logical explanation. He believed in logical explanations the way some people believe in God, with a devotion that was sincere and comprehensive and slightly resistant to evidence. The agency probably collected more information than the file shows, he said. Family obituaries are online. People research the families they're going to. It makes sense. He was probably just trying to feel prepared. It was possible. It was even reasonable. But it didn't feel right, and I had learned, slowly, over years of living with a heart that had been trained to mistrust its own perceptions, that when something doesn't feel right, the feeling deserves investigation. On the fourth night after the dinner incident, I sat alone in the kitchen at midnight with a cup of cold coffee and my laptop. I started with what I knew. Marcus Cole, 16 years old, born in Durham, North Carolina, biological parents deceased. Father, Thomas Cole, deceased 4 years ago, cause of death listed as a car accident. Mother, Renata Cole, deceased 3 years ago, cause of death listed as pneumonia. I searched Thomas Cole, Durham, North Carolina. Standard results, nothing remarkable. Then I searched Renata Cole. And then, on the 7th page of results, I found a name in a footnote of an old local news article about a neighborhood fundraiser. Renata Holloway Cole. Her maiden name had been Holloway. My blood went cold. Ray Holloway, the man in the photograph. My father's business partner, who died in a fire 30 years ago. Renata Holloway Cole, Marcus's mother, whose maiden name was Holloway. Could it be coincidence? There were other Holloways. It was not an uncommon name, but the coincidence, if it was one, was arresting enough that my hands were shaking as I typed the next search. Ray Holloway, Durham, North Carolina fire. The article was old, digitized from a 1994 newspaper archive. Ray Holloway, 34, had died in a fire at his business office. The fire had been ruled accidental. He was survived by a younger sister, Patricia Holloway, and a widowed mother. No children. Younger sister, Patricia. I kept reading. Patricia Holloway had later married a man named Cole. They had one son, Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole, Marcus's father, was Ray Holloway's nephew. Marcus Cole was the great-nephew of the man who had died in a fire at my father's business office. A fire my family had always called accidental. A fire I had never, in 30 years, been able to think about without a feeling I could not quite name gathering in the pit of my stomach. I closed the laptop, opened it again, closed it. This was not coincidence. This was architecture. Someone or something had arranged for this boy to walk through my door. Lesson woven in. The truth rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly in footnotes and archives and the 7th page of search results. Those who seek it must be patient, methodical, and willing to follow threads even when they lead somewhere frightening. Willful ignorance protects us in the short term and destroys us in the long term. There is a room in our house we do not discuss. Marcus asked about it on his first day. I lied. By week 3, he had somehow gotten inside, and what he left on the desk changed everything I thought I knew about my own father. Every family has a locked room. Sometimes it is literal, an actual door with an actual key that lives at the bottom of a drawer and is never discussed. Sometimes it is metaphorical, a subject, a name, a year that everyone in the family silently agrees to walk around rather than through. In our house, the locked room was both. It was a small study at the end of the upstairs hallway, the last door before the linen closet. David used it occasionally for his accounting work, but mostly it was my space, or rather, the space where I kept the things that belonged to a version of myself I was not ready to examine. My father's old files, his briefcase, 3 boxes of documents related to his business with Ray Holloway that I had never been able to make myself open. On the day Marcus arrived, he had walked the length of the upstairs hallway while David was showing him the layout of the house, and when he reached the study door and found it locked, he had paused, just for a moment. Then he had looked at me with a question in his eyes that I answered before he could ask it. Storage, I said. Nothing interesting. He had nodded and moved on. I thought nothing more of it. 3 weeks later, I came home from work on a Friday afternoon and found the study door slightly ajar. I stood in the hallway and stared at that 2-inch gap between door and frame, and for a long moment I could not make myself move. Then I pushed the door open. The room was as I had left it. Almost. My father's briefcase was on the desk. I always kept it on the shelf. It was open. The files inside, old business documents, ledgers, correspondence, were fanned out across the desk with the careful organization of someone who had been through them methodically. And in the center of the desk, placed deliberately, was a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy. Old, the paper quality suggested it was a copy of a document from the early 90s. It was a page from what appeared to be a business ledger, and 2 entries were circled in red pen. The first entry was a transfer of funds, a large sum, from an account I did not recognize into my father's business account. The second entry, made 6 months later, was a payment from my father's account to a company called Meridian Holdings. Below both entries, in neat, deliberate handwriting that I had never seen before, were 5 words. This is what he did. My father. This is what he did. I sat in the desk chair and felt the floor shift beneath me. I had never known what those old business files contained. I had kept them because throwing away my dead father's papers had felt like a betrayal. I had never opened them because part of me, the part that loved him fiercely and grievingly and without reservation, had not wanted to know. Marcus knew. Marcus had read them. And Marcus was telling me something. But how had he gotten into a locked room? Lesson woven in. What we refuse to look at does not go away. It waits for someone else to find it. Our refusal to examine difficult truths from our family's past does not protect us from those truths. It merely ensures that when they finally surface, we are unprepared and defenseless. Examine your inheritance, not just its beauty, but its shadows. I asked Marcus directly. He looked me in the eye and said 7 words that collapsed 30 years of my life into a single, terrible sentence. I did not wait until morning. I did not discuss it with David first. I took the photocopy in my hand, walked down the hall to Marcus's room, and knocked. 3 sharp knocks, the kind that mean business, not courtesy. He opened the door immediately. He was still dressed, though it was past 10. He took one look at the paper in my hand, and his expression did not change. He stepped back from the door and let me in. His room was immaculate. Neat in the way that people who have learned not to count on staying anywhere become neat. Everything portable, everything contained, nothing pinned to walls or spread with the relaxed ownership of someone who has decided this is home. Except for one thing. Above his desk, taped carefully to the wall, was a photograph I had not seen before. A family photograph. People I did not recognize. A man, a woman, a young boy. "Sit down, Marcus," I said. He sat on the edge of his bed. I stood. I held up the photocopy. "How did you get into that room?" The lock is a standard pin tumbler, the same type as every interior door in the house. He paused. "I'm sorry for going through your things. The lock is, you picked the lock?" I needed to see the files. "Why?" "Why did you need to see my father's files? How do you even know about my father's files?" "Who are you, Marcus?" He was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then he looked up at me with those steady, dark eyes and he said, "My great-uncle Ray Holloway did not die in an accidental fire. Your father paid to have it covered up. I have proof. And I've been looking for this family for 3 years." 7 sentences. The room tilted. The photograph on my wall, the water glass on his desk, the lamp casting amber light. All of it suddenly sharp and strange, like objects seen through glass that had just cracked. "That is a very serious accusation," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "I know. My father was a good man." Marcus looked at me with something that was not cruelty and not triumph. It was something worse. It was compassion. He looked at me the way you look at someone you are about to hurt, who does not yet know the hurt is coming, and you feel sorry for them while knowing the hurt is necessary. "Good people," he said, "can do terrible things when they're afraid." Lesson woven in, confrontation, though terrifying, is the threshold of healing. We fear it because we believe the truth will destroy us. In most cases, the truth, however painful, is what finally begins the process of repair. What destroys us is not truth, but the sustained effort of keeping truth away. He pulled a folder from under his mattress. Inside was a 30-year paper trail that my father had built, brick by brick, to bury a dead man's legacy. And Marcus had assembled every single piece of it from public records, alone, over 3 years, at the age of 13. We sat in his room until 2 in the morning. Marcus laid it all out with the methodical clarity of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times. He spoke carefully, without drama, without accusation beyond what the documents themselves implied. He was 16 years old, and he spoke like a man twice his age who had learned, through necessity, to divorce emotion from evidence in order to survive. This is what he told me. "Ray Holloway and my father, Gerald Whitfield, had been business partners for 11 years. Their company, Whitfield and Holloway Financial, had been modestly successful, specializing in investments and estate planning for mid-tier clients in the Durham area. In 1993, Ray had discovered that my father had been quietly diverting client funds, moving them through the Meridian Holdings shell company, skimming a percentage off the top, covering the shortfalls with new client deposits. Not a massive fraud by Wall Street standards, but devastating to the individual families who trusted them. Ray had confronted my father. According to a letter Ray had written to his sister Patricia, Marcus's grandmother, and which she had kept for 30 years, my father had threatened Ray with exposure of a minor past legal violation, something Ray had done as a young man and that could destroy his career. The letter described a standoff, a negotiation, a deal my father was trying to force. 6 weeks after that letter was written, Ray Holloway was dead in a fire at the office, a fire that consumed all the business records, all the original client files, everything that documented the fraud. The investigation had been minimal. The ruling was accidental. My father had wept at the funeral. Marcus had found Patricia, his grandmother, 3 years ago, before her own death. She had given him the letter. Then she had given him more. Copies of financial documents she had kept, old bank records, a sworn written statement she had made for an attorney in 1995 that had never been used because she had been too frightened. With those documents as a foundation, Marcus, 13 years old, in his second foster home, spending every free hour in public libraries, had spent the next 3 years building the case, cross-referencing public business filings, tracking the Meridian Holdings paper trail, pulling old court records, identifying every piece of the puzzle. He had not done this to hurt me. He had told me this at the beginning, and I needed to hear it again now. Then why? I asked. Why arrange to be adopted by us? Why not just go to the police? Send me a letter. He was quiet for a moment. Because your father was dying when I found all of this. He died before I could get here. And you're the only one left. He paused. And because I needed to see for myself whether you knew. And, do you? Do you think I knew? He looked at me for a long time. No, he said finally. I don't think you knew. Lesson woven in. The truth does not belong only to the people who did wrong. It belongs also to the people who are wronged, and to those who inherit the aftermath of both. When a child takes it upon himself to carry the weight of a multi-generational injustice, we must ask ourselves, what have the adults in his world failed to do? I woke David at 2 a.m. He listened to everything I said. Then he told me something about himself, something he had kept secret for 11 years, that made the entire situation suddenly, catastrophically worse. I let Marcus keep talking until the folder was empty and there was nothing left to say. Then I went downstairs and stood in the dark kitchen for 20 minutes, not thinking, not feeling, just existing in the space between one version of my life and the next. Then I went to the bedroom and turned on the lamp and woke my husband. David blinked at me, sat up, read my face, became immediately fully awake. I told him everything. I spoke for 45 minutes without stopping, telling him about the research, the photocopy, the confrontation, the folder, the letter from Ray Holloway to his sister, the 30-year paper trail. David sat very still and listened. His face went through a sequence of expressions: disbelief, concern, the calculating look he got when he was processing complex information, and then, at the end, a look I had never seen on him before. A look I would later learn to call the face of a man who has been keeping a secret and who has just realized, with terrible clarity, that the moment of reckoning has arrived. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that I said his name twice. Then he said, "Sandra, there's something I need to tell you." In the 11 years before our marriage, David had worked as a junior financial analyst at a different firm in Durham. He had been 27, newly graduated, eager and idealistic. One of his first clients, referred by a colleague, had been a man named Gerald Whitfield, my father. David had run the preliminary account reviews for my father's portfolio, and in doing so, he had flagged what appeared to be an irregular transaction pattern, funds moving through an unfamiliar intermediary in a way that should have triggered a compliance review. He had flagged it to his supervisor. His supervisor had told him, in terms that were clear and unmistakable, to unflag it, to forget he had seen it, to submit the clean report. David had been 27 years old with student loans and a lease payment and no other job offers. He had unflagged it. He had submitted the clean report. He had never told anyone. He had left that firm 8 months later for reasons he had always described to me as a better opportunity. He had met me 2 years after that. He had recognized my last name. He had, in time, recognized that my father was the man whose account he had helped bury. He had said nothing. He had told himself there was nothing to say, that it was buried and done, that telling me would accomplish nothing but pain. He told me this sitting in our bed at 2:30 in the morning, and by the time he finished, we were both crying, though for different reasons, I think. I was crying because the ground beneath my life had just liquefied. He was crying because he had been carrying this for 11 years, and it had been so heavy, and he was so ashamed. "You knew," I said. "When you married me, you knew what my father had done. Not the details. Not about Ray. Just that something was wrong. But you knew." Yes. Lesson woven in, complicity is rarely dramatic. It is usually quiet, incremental, and motivated by the most ordinary fears: job security, social standing, the desire to avoid conflict. But quiet complicity is still complicity. The moment we choose our comfort over someone else's justice, we become part of the story we told ourselves we were only witnessing. At breakfast, the three of us sat at the same table and pretended to eat. Marcus poured orange juice for David. David thanked him. I watched this and thought, we are 3 people connected by a secret that has been growing in the dark for 30 years, and somehow we are passing the orange juice. Morning came with the particular cruelty that mornings have after a night of revelation. The sun indifferent, the coffee still needing to be made, the mundane architecture of daily life demanding continuation regardless of what has collapsed inside it. I had not slept. David had not slept. I heard Marcus moving around in his room at 6 a.m. and understood, with a bone-deep certainty, that he had not slept either. We assembled in the kitchen like survivors at a triage center, careful, tender toward each other, aware that everything had changed and uncertain about the protocol for the morning after everything changes. David made coffee. Marcus sat down at the table and looked at the surface of it. I stood at the window and watched the neighbor walk her dog in the early light. "I owe you an apology," David said. He was looking at Marcus. "For the position your family was put in. I should have done more when I had the opportunity. I know that doesn't fix anything." Marcus looked at him. "No," he said. "It doesn't." Then, after a pause, "But I believe you mean it." "What do you want?" I asked Marcus. I turned from the window. "Ultimately, what do you want from this?" He thought about it. This was one of the things I had begun to understand about Marcus. He did not answer carelessly. He took time with questions, treating them as the serious things they were. "I want the families to know," he said. "The client families. The ones who lost money. Some of them, I found some of them. There were 17 families. Most of them lost retirement savings. A few of them lost everything." He paused. "And I want Ray's name to not be nothing. He deserved better than to be nothing." I thought about my father, the man I had known, the man who had taught me to ride a bike and told me stories at bedtime and cried at graduations and held my hand in the hospital when I thought I was losing my first pregnancy. I thought about the way love for a person can be true and the person can still have done terrible things. I thought about how those two facts can both be real simultaneously and how learning to hold them both without collapsing is the work of a lifetime. "We can do that," I said. "We can help you do that." "We?" Marcus looked at me, and for the first time since he had arrived, I saw something in his face that was not composure, not strategy, not watchful patience. Something younger. Something that looked like relief, or the first tentative signal of it, the kind of relief a person feels not when the problem is solved, but when they're finally not carrying it alone. "We," I said. "You're part of this family, Marcus. Whatever that means going forward. You don't do this alone." Lesson woven in. The decision to repair rather than flee is one of the hardest and most important choices a human being can make. When confronted with terrible truths about the people we love, our instinct may be to run from the truth, from each other, from responsibility. Staying and choosing to repair is not weakness. It is the bravest possible response. We opened my father's boxes, all three of us, together. What we found inside was not only evidence of what he had done, it was evidence that, in his last years, he had known exactly what he did and had been trying, secretly and imperfectly, to make it right. That weekend, we carried my father's 3 boxes from the locked study to the kitchen table, and we opened them. I had been afraid of those boxes for 8 years. In the time since my father's death, I had moved them twice. Once from my childhood home to a storage unit, once from the storage unit to our house, without ever looking inside. They had existed in my periphery as a source of shapeless dread, and now that they were open on the kitchen table in the morning light, I could see that my dread had been right, but not entirely in the way I had imagined. There were financial documents, ledgers, correspondence, all the evidence Marcus had described from the outside, now visible from within. There was the Meridian Holdings thread, the diverted funds, the client accounts that had been quietly pillaged between 1989 and 1993. It was clear, once you knew to look for it, and it was damning. But there was something else. In the 3rd box, beneath a layer of old tax returns, was a folder labeled simply personal. Inside it were 17 sealed envelopes, each labeled with a name. Names I did not recognize. And inside each envelope was a cashier's check, drawn on an account I also did not recognize, for varying amounts, some thousands, some tens of thousands. Marcus took the folder and went through it slowly. His hands were very still. "These names," he said. He looked up. "These are the client families." We sat with that for a long moment. There was also a letter, handwritten, in my father's familiar, slightly cramped cursive, addressed to no one and dated February 10th, 4 days before his death. It began, "I do not know how to make this right, and I know now that I never will, but I know that silence is the worst of the choices left to me." He had written 17 letters, 1 to each family. He had never sent them. He had prepared the cashier's checks, amounts that were clearly calculated attempts at restitution, and never sent them either. He had died with them sealed in a folder in a box in a closet, intending to do something that he never found the courage to complete. Marcus held one of the envelopes for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, he was trying. "Too late," I said. And immediately, "I'm sorry. That was..." "No," Marcus said. "You're right. Too late. But still." He set the envelope down carefully. At least he tried. I thought about the kind of man who can be capable of fraud and cover-up, and also of this, of 17 letters written with trembling hands in the last days of his life, of checks he prepared with full knowledge that they would never be enough, of a private reckoning so painful that he couldn't quite cross the final threshold into action. I thought about the complexity of human beings. I thought about my father, and I wept, not just for Ray Holloway and the 17 families and the justice that came too late. I wept for my father too, for the man he could have been, for the man he was trying too late and imperfectly to become. Lesson woven in: human beings are not simply good or evil, they are both, in shifting proportions, across time. The person who wrongs us can also be the person who, in their private darkness, is fighting to make it right. This does not excuse the wrong, but it expands our capacity for understanding, and understanding is the precondition for any true healing. We found Ray Holloway's grave. It was unmarked. He had been buried in a county cemetery 30 years ago, and not one person had put up a stone with his name. Marcus had never seen it. When he finally did, this 16-year-old boy who had held himself together through 3 years of solitary investigation sat down in the grass and broke. It was Marcus who suggested we find the grave. He had known it existed. His grandmother Patricia had told him where Ray was buried, but he had never been able to get there. 3 years in foster care in various parts of the state, no car, no license, and the specific kind of imprisoned powerlessness that comes from being a minor with no permanent family and no one to drive you. We drove to the county cemetery on a Saturday morning. All 3 of us. The cemetery was a quiet, unfussy place. Old oaks, flat headstones, the particular respectful silence of a place that has been receiving the dead for a long time. The county records gave us the plot number, and we walked through the rows until we found it. Section G, plot 44. There was no headstone. There was a small metal marker, the kind the county uses for unclaimed or unfunded burials, stamped with a number. Not a name, a number. Marcus stopped in front of the metal marker and stood there for a long time. His back was to us. I could see the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that was, I had come to understand, his way of managing overwhelming feeling. He stood very still, and I stood a few feet behind him, and David stood beside me, and we let him have that space. Then, very slowly, he sat down on the grass in front of the marker, and he put his face in his hands. And he shook. It was the first time since his arrival that I'd seen Marcus cry, and it undid me completely. Not because it was sad, though it was desperately sad, but because I understood, watching it, exactly how much he had been carrying. For 3 years this boy had been carrying the weight of a family wrong, of a history that wasn't his fault and wasn't his responsibility, and that he had nevertheless taken on himself to fix because nobody else was doing it. He had done it alone, methodically, without support or resources, in the quiet spaces between a childhood that had already taken more from him than most people lose in a lifetime. I sat down beside him in the grass. I didn't touch him. I just sat beside him. After a while, David sat down on his other side. We sat there for maybe half an hour. Marcus cried, and then he stopped crying, and then he sat quietly looking at the metal marker with a number where his great uncle's name should have been. "We'll put up a stone," I said. "With his name. Ray Jerome Holloway," Marcus said. His voice was rough but steady. Born June 3rd, 1959. Died March 17th, 1994. "Ray Jerome Holloway," I repeated. "We'll put it up this month." Marcus nodded. Then he said, "He never married. He never had kids. He was just a person trying to do the right thing. And then he wasn't here anymore." "He had you," David said, "even if he never knew it. He had someone who cared enough to spend 3 years making sure he wasn't forgotten." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's the first time anyone's ever said something like that to me," he said. "Lesson woven in, every human life deserves to be marked, remembered, and honored. When we fail to mark the lives of those who were wronged, especially when we benefit from their silence, we participate in an ongoing injustice. To rectify that injustice, even partially and late, is a moral imperative that can begin to heal wounds that have been open for decades." We sent the letters. All 17 of them. My father's handwritten words, his cashier's checks, and a separate letter from me explaining everything. Within 2 weeks, 12 families had written back. 3 of those letters made me collapse at the kitchen table. One of them changed everything. The decision to send the letters was not made lightly. We discussed it across several evenings, the 3 of us, sitting at the kitchen table that had become our war room, our confessional, our shared space for the kind of conversation that most families never have. The practical complications were real. Some checks were 30 years old. Some clients were dead. Their families scattered. Some amounts were clearly inadequate. Inflation alone had made them symbolic rather than restorative. The legal picture was murky. We consulted, discreetly, with an attorney who specialized in financial fraud, and she told us that criminal liability had likely expired through the statute of limitations, but that civil exposure was a different question. "My father is dead," I said. "His estate might not be," she said. We went ahead anyway. I am not the kind of person who can know that 17 families were defrauded and do nothing, regardless of the legal calculus. Marcus agreed. David agreed, with a particular fervor that I understood was partly about his own long-deferred reckoning. We wrote a covering letter. It took 4 drafts. It did not make excuses. It did not ask for absolution. It explained what had happened as plainly and completely as the documents allowed, included my father's original handwritten letters, enclosed the original cashier's checks, with a note acknowledging their inadequacy and an offer to discuss additional remediation, and provided our contact information. We sent them on a Tuesday. By the end of the following week, 12 families had responded. Most of the letters were formal, careful, written with the measured emotion of people who had learned not to expect justice. Some expressed gratitude. A few expressed anger, which was entirely appropriate and which we received without defense. 2 of the letters were from people who said that they had always suspected something was wrong, that they had filed complaints in the late 90s that were never properly investigated, that they had given up on ever hearing anything. One letter stopped me cold. It was from a woman named Dorothy Harris, 74 years old, in Charlotte. She wrote to say that the money my father had taken from her and her late husband had been their entire retirement savings, that they had spent their final decade in significant financial hardship, that her husband had died without the dignity he deserved because they could not afford the care he needed. And then she wrote, "I prayed for 30 years that whoever was responsible would someday have to face what they did. I did not expect that prayer to be answered by the victim's own daughter. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I need my heart back." I read that letter 5 times. Each time I got to the last sentence, I had to stop and wait until I could breathe again. Marcus read it too. He sat with it for a long time. "That's why I came here," he said finally. "Not for the revenge. For that. For someone to finally have to look at what was done." Lesson woven in accountability, true accountability, not the performative kind, requires that we look directly at the harm our actions have caused, not just the actions themselves. It requires that we hear the human cost. It is painful beyond description. It is also the only pathway to genuine repair, both for the person harmed and for the person doing the accounting. 3 months after Marcus moved in, I found the journal. He hadn't hidden it. It was sitting on his desk, and the last entry was addressed to me. He had been writing to me since before we met. The journal was a plain black composition notebook, the kind sold in every drugstore and school supply section in the country. It was sitting on Marcus's desk one afternoon when I knocked and entered to tell him dinner was ready, and he wasn't there. He was in the bathroom, and I saw it, and I read the cover because it wasn't a cover designed to be private. It had a label on it, neat handwriting for MRS, Whitfield. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. Then I called his name, and when he appeared, I pointed to the notebook and raised an eyebrow.
"You can read it," he said.
"I was going to give it to you eventually. I've been writing it since I started planning all of this." I carried the journal downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and read it. It took 2 hours. The first entry was dated 3 years ago, when Marcus was 13. It began, "Today I met my great-grandmother's pastor, who told me that she asked him, before she died, to make sure her grandson knew the truth. He gave me the letter. I have read it 6 times. I am going to find out what happened to Ray Holloway, and I am going to find the people who are responsible, and I am going to make sure it doesn't just disappear into nothing the way it has been disappearing for 30 years. He wrote about the research, the library hours, the dead ends, and the breakthroughs. The foster homes where he had hidden his files under mattresses and inside textbook covers. The nights when he was exhausted and angry and frightened that he was too small for the task he had set himself. The night a foster brother found his folder and threatened to destroy it unless Marcus paid him money, and how Marcus had quietly transferred every document to a memory stick that he kept in his shoe. He wrote about the adoption agency, about deliberately seeking out families in the Durham area, older families with long local roots, hoping to narrow the geography, about finding the Whitfield name and following the thread, about the agonizing months of uncertainty while the adoption process moved at its bureaucratic pace. And he wrote about us, about driving past the house before the adoption was finalized, just to look at it, about what he was hoping for and what he was afraid of, about the night before he moved in, writing, "Tomorrow I meet them. I have thought about this moment for so long that it doesn't feel real. I keep reminding myself that they are not the enemy. They are people who are also, in some way, victims of what was done. I need to remember that. I need to not walk in there ready for war." The last entry was dated 2 weeks ago. It read, "I think she knows now, or most of it. I think she is choosing to stay. I did not allow myself to hope for that. I don't know exactly what this family is, or what I am in it, or what anything means going forward. But today at dinner she laughed at something I said, and it was real, not polite, just real, and I thought, this might be something. For the first time in a long time, I thought this might actually be something. I closed the journal and sat for a while with my hands flat on the cover. Then I went upstairs, knocked on Marcus's door, and when he opened it I said, "You are the bravest person I have ever met." He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he did something I had not seen him do before. He smiled, not the careful, managed expression I had come to know. A real smile, sudden, a little unguarded, startled into existence by something he didn't fully expect. Lesson woven in: bravery does not always look the way we expect. It is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is a 13-year-old in a foster home, hiding files in his shoe, refusing to let an injustice disappear just because disappearing is easier. Bravery is the decision to keep going when you are exhausted and afraid and alone. It is one of the most human things there is. David asked for a meeting with the attorney, not to protect us, to do the thing he should have done 27 years ago. It cost him. It cost him badly. And watching him do it made me fall in love with him all over again. After the letters were sent and the responses began arriving, David made a decision that he told me about on a Sunday morning over breakfast. He had scheduled a meeting with our attorney. He was going to provide a formal written statement detailing what he had observed at his former firm in 1999, the irregular transaction he had flagged and been told to bury. He was going to name his former supervisor. He was going to put it on record. This may have professional consequences, he said. He meant his accounting license, his reputation, his firm, the clients who might pull away from someone associated, however distantly, with a financial fraud. I know, I said. It probably won't result in any prosecution. The statute of limitations, the age of the evidence. David, I said, why are you explaining this to me? He looked at me. I want to make sure you're. Do it, I said. You should have done it in 1999. Do it now. He nodded. He looked relieved in the way of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to give him permission to do the right thing, and is ashamed that he needed the permission and grateful that it was given without judgment. Marcus was in the room during this conversation. He was eating toast and pretending to be absorbed in his phone, and I could tell from the quality of his not looking at us that he had heard every word. When David got up to take his plate to the sink, Marcus said, without looking up, "That matters. What you're doing. It matters even if nothing legal comes of it. It matters because it's true, and you're saying it's true." David stood at the sink for a moment with his back to us. "I should have said it 27 years ago," he said. "Yes," Marcus said. "Then. But you're saying it now." The meeting with the attorney happened the following Thursday. David came home quieter than usual, made dinner without being asked, and sat with Marcus watching basketball for 3 hours while I graded papers in the next room, listening to the sounds of the two of them, the commentary, the occasional argument over calls, the specific domestic normalcy of two people who are beginning, tentatively and imperfectly, to inhabit the same space as family. His former supervisor, when contacted by the attorney with a request to respond, did not respond. The statement went into the formal record, not to be prosecuted, but to exist, to not be nothing. I thought about Dorothy Harris and her prayer. I thought about what it means to put truth on the record even when nobody is going to act on it, and I decided it means a great deal. It means that the truth exists, somewhere other than the silence it was buried in. It means that someone chose, however late, to say, "This happened. I know it happened. Let the record show that I said so." Lesson woven in: it is never too late to do the right thing. The writing may be imperfect. The damage may be unrestorable. The consequences may still arrive. But the act of choosing truth over silence, of standing on the side of justice even when justice is partial, is never wasted. It changes the person who chooses it, and that change ripples outward in ways we cannot always see. His English teacher called me. She said Marcus had written the most extraordinary essay she had ever read from a student. She asked if he was okay. I told her yes. But reading the essay, which he had titled the weight of what we carry. I wasn't sure I was. In the chaos of secrets and revelations and letters and attorneys and cemetery visits, there was also the ordinary forward momentum of daily life that insisted on continuing regardless. Marcus was enrolled in the 11th grade at Jefferson High School, and whatever extraordinary things were happening in our house in the evenings, he went to school every day in his gray hoodie and came home every afternoon and sat at his desk and did his work. He was academically extraordinary. This was not a surprise given the file, but it was still something to witness. The quality of his attention, the precision of his thinking, married couple in bed at night, serious emotional conversation, tension and guilt visible, soft warm light with dark shadows. The meeting between my 80-year-old mother and 16-year-old Marcus lasted 4 hours. I was not allowed in the room for most of it. When the door finally opened, my mother was holding his hand and calling him my boy. We drove to Wilmington the following Saturday. Marcus sat in the passenger seat for most of the drive in his characteristic silence, watching the highway pass, and I drove and let the silence be what it was without trying to fill it. Somewhere around the 2-hour mark, he said, "Is she angry at me?" "No," I said. "Does she blame me for all of this coming out?" "No." I thought for a moment. "She's grateful, I think, in the complicated way that people are grateful for things that hurt but needed to happen." He nodded, went back to the window. My mother met us at the door. She was dressed carefully, the yellow cardigan again, her good earrings, her hair done. She was performing for Marcus the way she had performed for every important occasion in my life, with full effort and zero irony, because she believed that the people in front of you deserve your best presentation. She took one look at Marcus and said, "You have your great uncle's eyes." Marcus went absolutely still. "I have a photograph," she said. "Come inside." I started to follow them, and my mother turned and, with the full authority of a woman who has been directing this household for 60 years, said, "Give us some time, Sandra." I sat in the garden for 4 hours. I could hear the murmur of voices from the sunroom window, my mother's steady, measured cadences, and occasionally Marcus's voice, lower, and once or twice something that might have been laughter. I drank 3 cups of tea that the staff brought out, and tried not to hover. When the door finally opened, my mother was holding Marcus's hand, not in the perfunctory way of a greeting, but in the way of someone who is claiming a connection. Marcus's face was open, in a way I had not seen before. The careful management was down. He looked young and tired and lighter, somehow, as though something he had been bracing against for a very long time had finally released. "He's coming for Christmas," my mother announced. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. In the car on the way home, Marcus sat quietly for a long time. Then he said, "She showed me the photograph of Ray. He looks kind." Another pause. She said she was sorry, that she should have spoken up sooner. She said it like she meant it. She did mean it. "It's strange," he said, "to be apologized to by an 80-year-old woman who didn't do anything to me personally. But it mattered. I didn't expect it to matter so much." "She was apologizing on behalf of everyone who stayed silent," I said, "including herself, including my father, including all the people who knew and chose not to see. It's a different kind of apology, but it's real." He thought about that for a while. "Yeah," he said finally, "it is." Lesson woven in, an apology given across generations, acknowledging harm done by people who are no longer alive, to people who are no longer alive, may seem symbolic rather than practical. But it is not merely symbolic. It is a statement that the community of the living chooses to stand on the side of truth rather than the side of the buried lie.
It releases something.
It matters. 6 months after Marcus arrived, David did something that made Marcus laugh for the first time, a real, unguarded laugh that filled the house. I stood in the hallway and cried, quietly, because that sound was the most hopeful thing I had heard in years. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a family, but sometimes 6 months contains more living than the prior decade. We had, in those 6 months, excavated the foundations of our life together and found the cracks, and we had decided, not once but daily, repeatedly, with effort, to repair them rather than abandon the structure. Marcus had settled into the house in the way that people settle when they finally believe they are allowed to. His room acquired the marks of habitation: books stacked sideways on the shelf, a hoodie thrown over the desk chair, a small collection of interesting rocks on the windowsill that he had been picking up since childhood, and which he could not quite explain and could not quite stop doing. He used the kitchen confidently and had somehow, without anyone arranging it, taken over Sunday breakfast, producing elaborate omelets and elaborate opinions about how eggs should be cooked. He and David had developed the specific bond of men who like the same kind of bad action movies and will not apologize for it. They had a running commentary system for sports broadcasts that involved a private vocabulary I was not fully initiated into and did not entirely want to be. They argued about basketball with a passion that was entirely genuine and occasionally ridiculous. The moment that made me cry in the hallway happened on a Saturday in February. David had been attempting, with considerable theatrical effort and minimal success, to assemble a piece of flat-pack furniture, a bookshelf for the study. Marcus had watched this effort for about 40 minutes from the kitchen doorway, arms folded, with an expression that was fighting hard to stay neutral and losing. Finally, when David knocked the half-assembled structure sideways for the third time and sat on the floor surrounded by identical-looking bolts and a manual that appeared to have been written in a language adjacent to but not quite English, Marcus walked in, sat down on the floor beside him, picked up the manual, and said, without looking up, "You've been putting Part D where Part B goes. You've been doing this since the beginning. It is genuinely impressive that you've gotten this far." David looked at him. "Are you criticizing my furniture assembly? I would never." A pause. "Part B is the one with the extra hole. They all have extra holes. The extra hole." And David laughed. And then Marcus laughed. A real, unguarded, whole-body laugh that I had never heard from him before, startled out of him by the stupidity of the furniture and the absurdity of the moment. And I was standing in the hallway, and I put my hand over my mouth and let myself cry quietly, because sometimes the most extraordinary thing in the world is an ordinary Saturday afternoon and a bookshelf and the sound of your family laughing. We finished the bookshelf together. It took another 2 hours. It listed slightly to the left. David called it artistically dynamic. Marcus called it a safety hazard. It was the first piece of furniture Marcus had ever assembled with a parent, in a house he was beginning, carefully and tentatively and genuinely, to think of as home. Lesson woven in: healing does not arrive in grand gestures. It arrives in the accumulation of ordinary moments, shared meals, bad jokes, furniture that lists slightly to the left. The decision to stay and build, day by day, in the spaces between the hard conversations, is where real family is made. Not in biology, not in paperwork, in showing up repeatedly and choosing each other. At Marcus's 17th birthday dinner, he made a toast. He was not a person who gave toasts. He was not, generally, a person who made speeches or said anything that he hadn't carefully considered first. So when he stood up, all three of us went quiet. What he said next, I will carry for the rest of my life. We had decided that Marcus's 17th birthday would be celebrated properly, which was apparently a novel experience for him. Birthdays in foster care tended toward the perfunctory when they were acknowledged at all, and several had passed without any acknowledgement at all, which was a fact I tried not to dwell on too much because the grief of it made me want to go backward through time. My mother came up from Wilmington. David made Marcus's requested meal: jerk chicken, rice and peas, fried plantains, a recipe combination that Marcus had taught him over 3 Sunday cooking sessions and that David had reproduced with an earnestness bordering on the sacred. I made the cake, chocolate, 3 layers, because Marcus had mentioned once in passing that his grandmother used to make chocolate layer cake and had said it was the best thing he had ever eaten. We sat around the dinner table, the 4 of us, Ruth with her good earrings, David slightly flour-dusted from the afternoon's cooking, Marcus in a new shirt, navy blue, my mother's gift, delivered with the authority of someone who has an opinion about what young men should wear, and me, and we ate and talked and laughed and were, against all reasonable probability, a family. After the main course, Marcus stood up. He held his water glass. I immediately began to worry about my mascara. He said, I have thought a lot over the past months about what I was looking for when I came here. I thought I was looking for justice, for acknowledgement, for a wrong to be made, as right as it could be made. And I found those things, or we found them together, which is different and better.
He paused.
But I found something else that I was not expecting and was not looking for. I found this. He gestured at the table, at us. I found people who, when they found out the worst things about themselves and their family, chose to face it rather than run from it. That is not a small thing. That is actually a very rare thing. Another pause. I have spent a long time not having a family. I know now what that absence costs. I know also what a family, a real one, can be. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is the decision to meet difficulty together rather than alone. He raised his glass. I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful you let me in. And I'm grateful, every day, that we are honest with each other. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. My mother was crying without making any effort to stop. David had the expression he gets when he is also crying, but is hoping nobody notices. I was simply not pretending. Marcus sat down and said, with perfect timing, "Please don't everyone cry at once. I cannot handle this." We cried at once. He endured it with enormous patience and only moderate embarrassment, and then he helped himself to a second piece of chocolate layer cake and declared it almost as good as his grandmother's, which we all agreed was high praise. Lesson woven in, a family is not a genetic fact. It is a daily decision to show up, to be honest, to face hard things together rather than separately, to acknowledge what we owe each other in truth and in care. Biology may begin the story, but character writes it. And the family we choose and who chooses us can be every bit as real and permanent as the one we are born into. On a Sunday morning in March, a year after Marcus moved in, we stood at Ray Holloway's grave and unveiled a headstone. Every person Marcus had contacted came. 12 families. Dorothy Harris, a journalist, and one man none of us expected, a retired police detective who had worked the fire investigation in 1994 and who had, 30 years later, come to say he was sorry he hadn't looked harder. The headstone arrived from the monument company on a Tuesday, and we had arranged for the installation to happen quietly, early in the week, so that by Sunday it would be settled and solid in the earth. We had chosen gray granite, simple, dignified, exactly right. It read, Ray Jerome Holloway, June 3rd, 1959 to March 17th, 1994. Beloved son and brother, a man who told the truth. That last line was Marcus's. He had submitted it to the monument company himself, without telling us first, and when I saw the proof, I understood immediately that it was perfect and that nothing else could have been said. The gathering on Sunday was not something any of us had orchestrated. Marcus had sent a simple message to the families who had responded to our letters. No formal invitation, no agenda, just, if you'd like to be present when the stone is placed, we'll be at Section G, Plot 44, Restwood Cemetery, 10 o'clock Sunday morning. He had not expected many people. He had expected perhaps a few. 43 people came. Some were the client families, people now in their 60s and 70s, some who had driven hours, some who came alone, and some with adult children. Dorothy Harris was there with her daughter. She walked straight to Marcus when she arrived and held both his hands and said nothing, and that nothing was more eloquent than anything words could have accomplished. A journalist came, a young woman from the Durham paper who had heard about the case through our attorney and asked respectfully whether she could attend. We had said yes. The story, when it ran the following week, was careful and human and did not sensationalize. It gave Ray Holloway a name and a history and a reason to be remembered. The retired detective's name was Harold Beaumont. He was 70 years old and had found our attorney's written filing through a legal database search he had made. He told us this himself, standing with his hat in his hands, a man who had clearly rehearsed what he was going to say and was delivering it anyway in a rough and unsteady voice. He said that he had always felt something was wrong about the fire investigation, that he had been a young detective and his senior partner had moved them off the case quickly, that he had thought about it over the years, that he was sorry. Marcus listened to him, thanked him, shook his hand. We unveiled the stone together. Marcus and me and David and my mother, each with one hand on the cloth, pulling it away at the same moment to reveal the gray granite and the gold lettering in the morning light. Someone in the crowd began to clap, and then everyone was clapping, which I had not expected, and which felt absolutely right. Not triumphant, but affirming, saying, "This person existed. This person mattered. We remember." Marcus stood in front of the stone for a long time. The crowd gave him space. I stood a few feet behind him, close enough that he knew I was there, far enough that he had the moment he needed. When he turned around, his face was composed and clear, and his eyes were bright, and he looked, I can only say this and hope it translates, like a person who has put down a weight they've been carrying for so long that the absence of it is both relief and grief, and something for which there is no exact word. "It's done," he said. "Not done," I said. "Different."
He thought about that. "Yeah," he said.
"Different." We walked back to the car together. The four of us, Marcus and me, David and my mother, and around us the 43 people who had come on a Sunday morning to stand on the side of truth. And the March light came through the oak trees and long, gold columns, and somewhere nearby a bird was singing, and the world was not fixed, and the damage was not undone, and the dead were still dead, and the years were not returned. But the truth was on the record. The name was on the stone. The silence was over. And for one boy who had carried a secret alone through the most difficult years of his life, and for one family that had decided, every day, imperfectly, with effort, to face rather than flee, that was enough to begin. The lessons we carry, a message to the reader. This story, of adoption, of buried secrets, of a boy who refused to let the truth die, is fictional. But every human truth within it is real. Let us name them plainly, so they travel with you when you close this book. First, secrets do not die when we stop speaking them. They descend, they compound, they grow roots, and they wait. The act of bearing a truth is not the end of that truth. It is merely the beginning of the underground life it will live until someone, somewhere, brings it back into the light. The cost of excavation is always lower when we choose it willingly than when it is chosen for us. Second, complicity is ordinary, not extraordinary. It does not require malice. It requires only the willingness to prioritize our own comfort over someone else's justice. Each of us in our lives will be given moments where we can speak up or stay silent. The choice we make in those moments defines us, not dramatically, not publicly, but in the private ledger of who we actually are. Third, good people do terrible things. Terrible people do good things. Human beings are not categories, they are ongoing processes, capable of both harm and repair, sometimes in the same lifetime, sometimes in the same day. Holding this complexity in the people we love, in ourselves, is the work of emotional and moral maturity. Fourth, a family is a decision, made daily, to show up. It is not the absence of conflict or the perfection of people. It is the commitment to face difficulty together rather than separately, to prioritize honesty over comfort, to choose the hard conversation over the safe silence. Families of choice can be every bit as real and as binding as families of birth. Fifth, the bravery of young people is real and radical. Marcus Cole, the boy in this story, did what generations of adults had failed to do. He was 13 years old, alone, with no resources and no support, and he decided that an injustice would not simply be absorbed into the silence that had swallowed it. His bravery cost him. It also saved him. The young people in our lives are not merely developing into full human beings. They are already full human beings, capable of extraordinary moral clarity, and we should listen to them accordingly. Sixth, it is never too late. David was 27 years too late. My mother was 30 years too late. My father's letters were never sent. And yet, the stone was placed. The names were spoken. The families heard what had been done. Dorothy Harris got her prayer answered. Too late is not the same as pointless. Repair, even imperfect and partial and decades delayed, changes things. It changes the people who do it and the people who receive it, and the story that gets passed forward. And finally, seventh, truth is the only ground on which anything real can be built. Not comfortable truth, not convenient truth, Not the selective truth that includes the parts we are proud of and omits the parts that shame us, but the full, complicated, painful, necessary truth about who we are and what we have done. Only on that ground can trust grow. Only on that ground can love endure. Only on that ground can a family, in all its broken, beautiful complexity, truly begin.